9 days after I buried my wife, my son and his wife called a meeting in my own boardroom to inform me that I no longer owned the company I built with my bare hands. My daughter-in-law set a folder on the table, slid it toward me with one polished fingernail, and told me to sign my name on the last page and disappear quietly. My son sat beside her studying the carpet, unable to lift his eyes to mine. They were certain a heartbroken old man would crumble. They had spent months planning every word of that morning. What they had not planned for was the person about to walk through the door behind them. Before I tell you how the whole thing came apart, do me a small favor. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me which town you are watching from tonight. It means more than you know to an old man to see how far these stories reach. Now, let me start at the beginning. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. My name is August Halloran, though everyone who has known me longer than a handshake calls me Gus. I am 71 years old, and for 46 of those years I ran Halloran Tool and Die, a precision manufacturing company I started in a rented cinder block garage with one used lathe and a loan I was not entirely sure I could repay. We made the small, exact metal parts that go inside machines nobody ever thinks about. The components that have to be right to the width of a human hair, or a whole assembly line grinds to a halt. It is unglamorous work. It is also work that built a company worth better than $30 million, put 300 people on a payroll, and gave my family a life I never had growing up. My wife, Helen, stood at the center of all of it for every single year. Helen was not the kind of wife who waited at home. She kept our books for the first 2 decades. She talked me out of 3 bad deals that would have sunk us, and she remembered the name of every worker's spouse and every worker's child. When she walked the factory floor, grown men who would not smile for the boss lit up like boys, because Helen had asked about their mother's surgery. She was the warmth in a business that runs on cold steel. And when the cancer took her this past spring, it did not just take my wife. It took the soul out of the whole enterprise, and it left a vacuum that certain people had been waiting a very long time to fill. I should tell you how Helen and I met, because it explains the shape of everything that followed. I was 24, up to my elbows in cutting oil, and she was the daughter of the man who owned the machine shop across the road, hired to do his invoicing. She came over one afternoon to collect a late payment I genuinely could not make, and instead of taking the check I did not have, she sat down on an overturned bucket, looked at my books for 20 minutes, and told me I was underpricing every job I quoted by roughly a third. She was right. I raised my prices the next Monday, kept the shop alive, and married her 14 months later. For 46 years, whenever I was about to make a decision out of pride or fear, Helen was the one who sat me down on a bucket and showed me the number I did not want to see. Losing her was like losing the part of my own mind that kept me honest. I have 2 children. My son Colby is 44, and I will be honest with you the way a man can only be honest about his own blood when he has run out of illusions. Colby was born wanting the finish line without the race. I gave him a vice presidency he did not earn, an office with a view, a salary that embarrassed the people who actually did the work, and none of it was ever enough. Because a man who is handed everything learns only that he is owed more. 4 years ago, he married Danielle, and Danielle was the accelerant to a fire that was already smoldering. She came from money that had run out and spent her life trying to get back to it. And she looked at Halloran Tool and Die the way a hawk looks at a field mouse. My daughter Claire is 39, and she is the opposite of her brother in every way that matters. Claire never asked me for a dime past the age of 22. She put herself through nursing school working night shifts, and she works them still in the intensive care unit of the county hospital, holding the hands of frightened strangers at 3 in the morning. When Helen was dying, it was Claire who moved back into the house. Claire who learned the medications and the feeding schedule. Claire who slept in a chair by the bed so her mother would never wake alone. Colby visited twice. Danielle sent flowers with a card a florist wrote. And I watched all of it, and I said nothing, and I remembered every moment of it. Because a man who has spent his life reading tolerances learns to notice exactly where a thing is strong and exactly where it will fail. People ask me sometimes how a father can love two children so differently, and the honest answer is that I do not love them differently at all. I love them exactly the same. It is only that one of them made himself easy to be proud of, and the other made herself impossible to trust. And love does not erase what your eyes can plainly see. I gave Colby every advantage precisely because I loved him, and somewhere along the way, the advantages became the poison. I have watched it happen to other men's sons too, at other companies, the ones handed the corner office before they ever earned a callus. Comfort without struggle does not build character. It dissolves it, slowly, the way water finds the flaw in a casting and works at it, season after season, until the whole part gives way at the worst possible moment. The betrayal did not begin at the funeral. It began about 8 months before, when Helen's diagnosis turned from bad to final. I started noticing Colby in the office at strange hours, and documents printed that I had not requested, and Danielle, suddenly very interested in the difference between the company shares and the family trust. A man builds a certain instinct over 46 years. I did not confront them. I did something better. Here is the thing the young never understand about the old. They see the gray hair and the slow way I climb the stairs now, and they conclude that the machinery upstairs has slowed to match. It has not. If anything, grief sharpened it. In those 8 months, I watched my son and his wife the way I used to watch a new hire on a dangerous press. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the patient, total attention of a man who has seen what happens when you look away at the wrong second. I noted which files Colby opened. I noticed Danielle befriending my longtime accountant, asking him warm questions about trusts and shares over lunches she paid for. I said nothing to either of them. A man who tips his hand loses it. A man who watches quietly keeps every card. I went quietly to see the one person in this world I trust as completely as I trusted Helen, my attorney of 30 years. A sharp and merciless woman named Ruth Okafor, and I asked her a simple question. If the people closest to me ever tried to take everything I built, how would they do it? And how would I stop them before they knew I saw it coming? Ruth laid it out for me plainly. The danger, she said, was never a lawsuit. A lawsuit is loud and slow and public, and greedy people hate all three of those things. The real danger was a quiet transfer of ownership, executed while I was too grief-stricken to fight, papered to look legitimate, and pushed through before anyone thought to check it. The way you stop that, she told me, is you make the thing they want impossible to take before they ever reach for it. So, over the following weeks, with Helen's full knowledge and her signature beside mine on every page, we did exactly that. We moved the controlling ownership of Halloran Tool and Die out of my personal name entirely and into an irrevocable trust, and we named a single trustee to control it after I was gone. We did not name Colby. We named Claire. Helen and I made that decision together at the kitchen table in one of her last clear afternoons, and she cried when we signed it. Not from sadness, but from relief. She said she had spent years afraid of what Colby would do to the people on that factory floor if he ever got his hands on them. And now she could stop being afraid. We told no one. Not Claire, who would have refused it out of humility. Certainly not Colby. The trust was sealed, dated, and witnessed, and it sat in Ruth Okafor's office like a loaded truth, waiting for the right moment. I want to be clear that I took no pleasure in any of this preparation. There is a particular grief in building a legal fortress against your own son, in sitting in a lawyer's office spelling out, clause by clause, all the ways your child might try to rob you. Every page I signed was a small funeral for the boy I remembered, the one who used to ride on my shoulders through the factory on Saturday mornings, pointing at the machines and asking what each one did. I kept hoping, right up to the end, that I was wrong about him, that some better instinct would surface, and he would come to me in Helen's last days, not with a scheme, but with a shovel, ready to work, ready to grieve. He never did. And so the fortress stood, and I hated that I had needed to build it, and I was grateful beyond words that I had. Helen passed 3 weeks later, and 9 days after we lowered her into the ground, my son and his wife made their move, exactly as Ruth had predicted, right down to the paper. They called it a family meeting. The email from Danielle used soft words, healing and closure and moving forward together, and it asked me to come to the executive boardroom on a Tuesday morning to discuss the future of the company. I read that email 4 times, and each time I admired, in a grim sort of way, how carefully it had been built. Every phrase was designed to sound like kindness while functioning as a trap. A grieving man is supposed to hear the word healing and think of comfort, not realize he is being summoned to his own execution. They had even chosen the boardroom instead of the house, because a boardroom feels official, and official things feel harder to refuse. Danielle understood something true about people, that most of us will sign almost anything if the room is intimidating enough and the person across the table is smiling. What she did not understand was that I had spent 46 years on the winning side of intimidating rooms, and I had never once signed a page in any of them that I had not first read 3 times with my glasses on. I knew what it was the moment I read it, the way you know a storm is coming from the color of the sky. So I put on the same gray suit I had worn to Helen's funeral, and I drove to the building I had constructed from nothing, and I walked into that boardroom, and I sat down at the head of the long table where I had closed 1,000 deals, and I waited for my children to try to rob me. The drive there took me past the loading docks where I unloaded my first truck at 19, past the old cinder block unit that was our entire company for the first 3 years, past the parking lot where Helen and I used to eat sandwiches on the tailgate because we could not afford a lunch out. 46 years of a life, all of it visible through a windshield in the space of 2 minutes. I did not feel afraid on that drive, and I did not feel angry either, not anymore. I felt something closer to sorrow, the heavy calm of a man who already knows how a thing ends and only has to walk through the motions of it. My son was about to show me, in front of witnesses, exactly who he had become. And I was about to show him, for the first and last time, exactly who he had always been dealing with. Colby was already there when I arrived, and so was Danielle, and so, to my quiet surprise, was a lawyer I did not recognize, a slick young man in a suit that cost more than his experience justified. Danielle did most of the talking. She had a way of smiling that never reached her eyes, and she smiled that way at me now as she opened a leather folder and drew out a thick stack of documents. She squared the pages against the table with 2 sharp taps, and she slid them across the polished wood until they stopped in front of me. "Gus," she said, in the gentle voice people use on the very old and the very sick, "we all know this company is too much for you now, especially after everything. So we have made it simple. This transfers the ownership to Colby, effective immediately. You sign on the last page, you keep a comfortable pension, and you get to finally rest. It is what Helen would have wanted. I have been told a great many lies across a long life. Suppliers lied to me about delivery dates. Competitors lied to my customers. Once, a partner lied to me for 2 years about where the money was going. But I do not think I have ever, in 71 years, heard anything as obscene as my daughter-in-law telling me what my own dead wife would have wanted. 9 days after I buried her, while she pushed a forged version of that wife's signature across the table toward me. Helen had spent her final clear afternoon making certain this exact moment could never succeed. And here was Danielle, waving her name around like a prop, sure that the single word Helen was a lever she could pull to make the old man fold. It took everything I had not to react, but I learned long ago that the deepest anger is best kept behind a still face, because a still face gives your opponent nothing to read, and everything they cannot read, they fear. It was the invocation of Helen's name that turned something cold and steady inside my chest. I looked down at the documents. They were professionally done, I will give them that, and clipped to the front was the thing they were counting on, a 1-page agreement dated 4 months earlier, titled As a Gift of Helen's Personal Shares to Her Beloved Son Colby, and signed at the bottom in what was meant to look like my wife's careful hand. I recognized the forgery instantly, because I had watched Helen sign her name 10,000 times across 46 years. And whoever had traced that signature had gotten the loops right and the pressure wrong. My wife had been dead 9 days, and her own son was using a counterfeit of her signature to steal the company she died protecting. There is a specific coldness that comes over a man in a moment like that, and I felt it settle into me at the head of that table. It is not rage. Rage is hot and clumsy, and it makes you say things that hand your enemy the advantage. This was the opposite of rage. It was the cold, clear, focused stillness I used to feel standing over a job that had to be right the first time, when there was no room left for error and no time left for feeling. My hands did not shake. My voice, when it came, did not waver. Somewhere in that room, my grief for Helen and my grief for the son I thought I had raised fused into a single hard point of resolve, and I let it carry me, because it was the only thing steady enough to hold. I did not raise my voice. I have never once in my life needed to raise my voice to win a fight, and I was not going to start over a forged piece of paper. I looked across the table at my son, and I waited until he was forced to lift his eyes to mine, and I held them there for a long moment, while the air conditioner hummed, and Danielle's confident smile began, very slightly, to stiffen at the corners. Then I folded my hands on top of their worthless documents, and I said quietly, "Before I sign anything, I think we should have my attorney join us. She is just outside." And I watched the first flicker of uncertainty cross Danielle's face, because that was not in the script she had written. I pressed the small button on the underside of the table, the one I had used for 4 decades to call in my assistant, and the heavy boardroom door opened, and Ruth O'Caffer walked in. She was 70 years old, silver-haired, unhurried, carrying a plain accordion folder under one arm, and she did not look at Colby or Danielle or their expensive young lawyer. She looked only at me, and she gave me a small nod, and she took the empty seat at my right hand, and she set her folder on the table with the quiet finality of a judge closing a book. Danielle's lawyer sat up straighter. Colby had gone the color of wet cement. I have known Ruth Okafor for 30 years, and in all that time I have never once seen her rush. She came up the way I did, from nothing, the first person in her family to finish school, and she built her practice defending people who had been quietly robbed by people who assumed no one would fight back. She and Helen had been friends, real friends, the kind who talked on the phone for an hour about nothing. When Helen got sick, Ruth drove out to the house every Sunday, and the two of them would sit on the porch, and Ruth would pretend it was a social call and not a vigil. So when Ruth walked into that boardroom and set her folder on the table, she was not only there as my attorney, she was there for Helen, to finish the last thing Helen ever asked of her. And everyone who knew the history could feel it in the air. "Good morning," Ruth said pleasantly to the room. "I represent Mr. Halloran, and I have represented him for 30 years, so I am familiar with his affairs down to the last comma. I understand there is a document here transferring ownership of the company?" She reached across, drew the stack toward her, and studied the forged gift agreement clipped to the front for perhaps 4 seconds. Then she set it down, folded her hands the way I had folded mine, and said, "This is a problem, and it is not the problem you think it is." She opened her own folder and removed a single certified document, heavy stock, embossed and notarized, and she laid it in the center of the table where everyone could see the seal. "8 months ago," Ruth said, "Mr. Halloran and his late wife transferred 100% of the controlling interest in Halloran Tool and Die into an irrevocable trust. That means the company has not been Mr. Halloran's personal property to give or to be taken since long before this meeting was ever called. The shares your document references, the ones supposedly gifted to Colby, do not exist in the form you are claiming. They were placed in trust, legally and permanently, with both signatures witnessed and recorded. Whatever you are holding, it transfers nothing, because there is nothing left in his hands to transfer." I watched those words land on my son and his wife the way I have watched a press come down on a sheet of steel. Slow and total and impossible to stop. Danielle's smile did not merely fade. It fell off her face completely. And what lay beneath it was not grief and not shame, but pure, calculating fear. The look of a gambler who has just understood the game was rigged from the opening hand, and not in her favor. She grabbed at the documents, flipped to the last page, then the first, as if the trust might vanish if she stared at the forgery hard enough. It did not. A properly built, irrevocable trust does not care how badly you want it to be something else. That is the entire purpose of it. Helen and I had raised a wall no amount of wanting could climb, and my daughter-in-law had just run into it at full speed. In front of witnesses. The silence in that room was total. Danielle's lawyer began flipping through his own copy, faster and faster, looking for a door that was not there. And then Ruth delivered the second blow, the one I had not fully prepared myself for, even though I had known it was coming. She picked up the forged gift agreement between 2 fingers, held it up to the light, and said, "There is also this. This document purports to bear the signature of Helen Halloran, dated 4 months ago. I have here 12 years of Mrs. Halloran's verified signatures, and I have already had a forensic document examiner review this one. It is a forgery. Forging the signature of a deceased person on a financial instrument in order to obtain property is not a family disagreement. It is a felony. It is fraud, and it is forgery. And depending on what the examiner finds about who created it, it may be several other things as well." The young lawyer they had hired went very pale at that, because he understood, as they did not yet fully, what those words meant for him personally. A lawyer who unknowingly presents a forged document has a bad afternoon. A lawyer found to have known can lose everything he owns. I watched him do the arithmetic in real time, watched him slide his own copy of the papers an inch away from himself, as though physical distance might create legal distance, and then begin, very quietly, to pack his briefcase. Ruth did not even glance at him. She had seen his kind 100 times, the hired gun who talks big until the moment real consequence enters the room and then suddenly remembers urgent business elsewhere. He was gone within 2 minutes, mumbling about withdrawing from representation, and he never sent a bill, which told me he knew precisely how near the edge he had come. Colby broke first. Of course he did. He had always been the kind of man who could plan a betrayal, but never survive the sight of it failing. I had seen that exact collapse in him 100 times before, in smaller ways, across his whole life. The time in high school he was caught cheating and wept and blamed the boy who sat beside him. The first job I got him with a supplier where he took credit for a colleague's work until it fell apart and then swore it had been the colleague's idea all along. Colby could always build the lie. He could never stand inside it once the walls started shaking. And so it was no surprise at all that the moment Ruth said the word forgery, my son did not fight, did not bluster, did not even try to hold the story together for the sake of his own wife. He simply came apart at the seams and reached, the way he always had, for the nearest person to blame. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked on the single word. "Dad, it was not my idea. I did not. Danielle said it would be. I never wanted." Danielle turned on him with a look of such pure contempt that I almost felt sorry for my son. Almost. And in that one glance, the whole architecture of their marriage stood revealed. The desperate social climber and the weak man she had chosen precisely because he was weak. Their expensive lawyer was already gathering his things, murmuring something about a conflict of interest and the need to withdraw, because men like him can smell a sinking ship the instant it takes on water. I let it play out. I did not gloat, and I did not shout, because there is no satisfaction to be found in watching your own child drown, even a child who tried to rob you over his mother's fresh grave. When the room had gone quiet again, I finally spoke, and I kept my voice as level as I had kept it the whole morning. "I built this company," I said, "so that the people who gave their lives to it would always be protected. Your mother spent her last good days making sure of it. You looked at the thing she died protecting, and you saw a prize to be grabbed. That is the difference between you and her, and it always was. You are not getting the company, Colby. You never were. And now you get to explain a forged signature to people with badges." I did not send my son to prison, though Ruth told me I could have, and though a colder man might have. I am his father, and I am too old to want to spend my last years attending my own child's trial. But I did not save him either. I cut him off completely. No pension, no settlement, no soft landing paid for by the company he tried to steal. Danielle filed for divorce within the month, the instant she understood there was no fortune left to extract. And Colby, stripped of the wife and the money that had been the whole point of his life, moved to another state to start over with nothing, which is exactly what he had earned. I heard some months later that the forensic examiner's report had concluded it was Danielle's hand that traced Helen's signature, with Colby's knowledge, and that a prosecutor had reviewed it. I did not press charges, and so it went no further than a report in a drawer and a warning that will follow them both quietly for the rest of their lives. Some people told me I was foolish, that I let them off too easy, that fear of prison is the only language people like that understand. Maybe they are right. But I did not do it for Colby, and I did not do it for Mercy. I did it for Helen. because she would not have wanted her name, the last thing they forged, to become the headline of a criminal trial. Her name deserved better than that. So I let it rest, and I put my energy into building something worthy of it instead. He writes to me sometimes. I read the letters. I have not yet written back. Perhaps I will, when the writing sounds less like a man who is sorry he lost, and more like a man who is sorry he tried. There is one more thing you need to understand about that morning, and it is the part that matters most. Through the entire meeting, through the ambush and the forgery and the collapse, one person was not in that room, because she did not even know it was happening. My daughter, Claire, was asleep after a 14-hour night shift, having no idea that her father and her late mother had quietly made her the trustee and heir to everything they built. I drove to her small apartment that same afternoon, and I sat her down at her little kitchen table, and I told her what Helen and I had done, and why. She did not celebrate. She cried, the same way her mother had cried the day we signed it. And the first thing out of her mouth was not "thank you." It was, "What about the workers? Are they going to be all right?" And in that single question, I heard my wife's voice so clearly that I had to look away. That was the whole difference, right there, in one sentence at a small kitchen table. Colby had looked at the company and seen a fortune to seize. Danielle had looked at it and seen a life to buy. And Claire, told that she now held all of it in her hands, thought first and only of 300 families she had never met, and whether they would be safe. I take no credit for that. Her mother built it. In 10,000 small moments, I was too busy running the company to witness. And hearing my daughter ask that question was like getting Helen's voice back for a few seconds, coming out of the person she had shaped most carefully and loved most fiercely. I had to turn and look out the window a while. I did not want my daughter to see her old father weep. Claire did not quit her nursing job, and I did not ask her to. She is nobody's idea of a factory executive, and she never wanted to be. But she is the trustee now, which means she holds the company in stewardship, and she has already asked me to help her set up something Helen and I only ever talked about: a fund from the company's profits that pays for the education of every worker's child who wants to go to college or learn a trade. She calls it the Helen Halloran Fund. It opens next fall. My wife's name will be on the wall of a place that sends the children of machinists and floor sweepers into a better life, which is the only kind of legacy she ever cared about leaving. I go into the office maybe 2 days a week now, not to run anything, just to be there, to walk the floor the way Helen used to, and ask the men about their families. A few of the older hands remember when it was only me and a single lathe, and we stand around telling lies about how strong we all used to be. The company is in good hands now, better than mine, honestly, because Claire runs it the way her mother would have, which is to say, she never forgets that the numbers on a page are really just people, and that a business is only ever as sound as the loyalty holding it together. Colby believed loyalty was something you could seize with a signature. He learned, far too late, that it is the one asset in this world that cannot be forged or bought or inherited against the will of the people who owe it. It can only be earned. His sister earned it. He did not. That, in the end, is the whole of it. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson underneath it is as real as tempered steel. For 46 years, I made my living machining metal to exact tolerances, learning precisely where a material is strong and precisely where, under pressure, it will crack. People are no different. My son cracked under the first pressure of his own greed, and my daughter held under a weight that would have broken almost anyone. And neither of those things surprised me, because I had been watching the whole time. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty does. Sacrifice does. The quiet person sleeping in the chair by the deathbed does, while the loud ones circle and plot. They wanted my inheritance. In the end, the only thing they inherited was the ruin they built with their own hands. My name is August Halloran, and everything I made, I left to the one child who never once asked me for any of it.